October 24th, 1415, northern France, near the village of Agincourt. The rain had fallen all night, cold, relentless, soaking the earth until it became a sea of mud. The fields smelled of wet clay, dung, and steel. Dawn crept pale and grey through a sky as heavy as lead. On a narrow strip of land between two forests, the English army waited, hungry, sick, and half dead from exhaustion. Barely 6,000 men stood against an enemy more than 3 times their number. At their centre, King Henry V walked among the ranks. He was only 29, his face thin, pale, carved by sleepless nights, but in his eyes burned something fierce and steady, the light of a man who had already decided that retreat was no longer possible. Behind him, rows of archers drove stakes into the mud, thick wooden stakes sharpened to deadly points, angled toward the open field where the French knights would charge. They worked in silence, their hands calloused, their clothes torn, faces smeared with dirt and rain. They were not noblemen. They were farmers, hunters, shepherds, men who had grown up pulling longbows taller than themselves. Their weapons were made of yew, their strings of hemp and sinew. Each archer carried a few dozen arrows, long, thin, fletched with grey goose feathers, their iron tips shaped like chisels. No one in France believed such men could stand against armoured knights. No one, except Henry. He had marched from Harfleur with disease and starvation stalking his army. Dysentery had killed more men than swords. Boots rotted, food ran out, and the cold crept through every layer of wool and leather. The French had shadowed him for weeks, closing every bridge, cutting every route home. Now, trapped near the small village of Agincourt, Henry's army had nowhere to go but forward. And waiting across the muddy plain, glittering even through the rain, stood the pride of France, more than 20,000 men-at-arms, the flower of French chivalry. They wore armour polished like mirrors, banners bright with heraldry, lions, lilies and crosses gleaming in the storm. Trumpets blared, horses snorted clouds of steam. It was not a battle, it was an execution waiting to happen. At dawn, Henry rode the line. His armour was plain, steel and leather, a simple crown circling his helmet. No silk, no jewels. He stopped among the archers, whose faces were grey with cold. "Good men," he said, voice carrying through the drizzle. "You stand in God's sight this day. They have more numbers, more horses, more armour, but we have more purpose. You fight not for gold nor glory, but for one another. Remember that." He smiled then, thin and fierce. "And remember the stakes. They'll break before we do." A few archers laughed. Most simply nodded, gripping their bows tighter. In the French camp, Constable Charles d'Albret looked across the valley and frowned. "The ground is soaked," he said. "Our horses will sink." The nobles around him shrugged, impatient. To them, the idea of waiting was shameful. They were knights, heirs to 3 centuries of conquest. The very sight of peasants defying them was insult enough. One baron spat into the mud. "We will crush them before midday." Another laughed. "They will die behind their sticks." No one listened to d'Albret's warnings. The arrogance of chivalry drowned out caution. By mid-morning, the rain eased. Mist drifted low over the field. The English had taken position along a narrow ridge between the woods of Tramicourt and Agincourt, a perfect choke point. Henry's infantry formed the centre, flanked by archers in wedges on both sides. Before them, the ground sloped gently downward, open, inviting, but turned by rain into treacherous mud. Henry looked at it and saw his only ally. He stood with his captains, Westmoreland, York, Exeter, and pointed toward the French line. "They will come proud and blind," he said. "The ground will slow them, their armour will drown them, and their horses will drag them down." York frowned. "And if they do not come?" Henry's eyes hardened. "Then we will make them." The morning stretched long. The French held their ground, waiting for the English to move first. Their lines shimmered with colour, banners of Burgundy, Orléans, Bourbon. Trumpets blared, drums rolled. But the English did not move. Henry ordered his archers forward, just a few yards, enough to provoke. The men carried their stakes, planted them again in the muck, and stood waiting, bows ready. Then, from the English line, the first arrows rose, a black swarm against a grey sky. They fell among the French horses with a sound like tearing cloth. Animals screamed, reared, fell. Knights cursed and tried to control them. It was an insult no French noble could bear. The first French charge came like thunder. Heavy cavalry surged forward, a wave of steel and fury. Hooves churned the mud, shields gleamed, voices shouted, Montjoie, Saint-Denis! Henry watched, calm, unflinching. Loose! He shouted. Thousands of bowstrings snapped, the air filled with the hiss of arrows. They came down in sheets, slicing through the mist, punching through armor gaps, slamming into horses' necks, eyes, flanks. Men fell, horses collapsed, riders tumbled, crushed beneath their own mounts. The field, already soaked, became a pit of bodies and mud. The French kept coming, wave after wave, each slower than the last, weighed down by armor, tripping over corpses. The mud clung to their legs like chains. Every step sank deeper. The English archers loosed again and again. Their fingers bled, but they did not stop. One archer, a farmer from Sussex, laughed between volleys. They said we were no soldiers, he muttered. Then let them learn what fields can do. By noon, the impossible had begun. The knights of France, the same class that had ruled battlefields for 300 years, were dying in the mud before a wall of peasants with bows. The symbols of chivalry, banners, crests, polished armor, were vanishing beneath muck and blood. Henry looked across the field and whispered, "So ends the age of iron pride." When the final French assault broke, silence fell, heavy and terrible. The rain began again, washing mud from corpses, revealing faces once proud, now pale and still. The English army stood stunned. Against all odds, they had survived. Henry removed his helmet, rain dripping down his scarred cheek. He looked toward heaven and said quietly, "Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give the glory." That night, fires burned low across the valley. The longbows, splintered and wet, lay stacked like offerings beside the wounded. The knights who had once ruled war lay silent in their armor, drowned by the very earth they had sought to command. And somewhere, in the flicker of the flames, a truth took shape, a truth that would echo for centuries. That courage without wisdom is pride, and pride, no matter how armored, will always fall before precision. Agincourt, October 25th, 1415, Feast of St. Crispin. The morning mist had lifted. In its place hung the stink of blood, sweat, and fear. The English line stood unbroken, soaked to the bone, spattered with mud and death, while across the field the French army gathered itself for one more blow. They refused to believe what their eyes had seen. Knights, men of noble birth and iron lineage, had fallen, not to equal steel, but to arrows drawn by peasants. It was unthinkable. For 3 centuries, armor and bloodline had ruled the battlefield. Now, in a single morning, the old order was cracking. The French commanders shouted over the din, desperate to rally. Forward, close ranks, crush the rabble. Trumpets wailed. New banners rose. Orléans, Alençon, Bourbon. From the rear, fresh columns of men-at-arms trudged into the slaughter. The mud was waist-deep in places, thick with the weight of men and horses that had fallen before. The wounded screamed beneath the feet of the living. The very earth seemed to swallow them whole. The charge began again, slower this time, more desperate than proud. On the English ridge, King Henry V wiped rain from his visor and watched the advancing wall of metal. His armor was dented, his cloak dark with mud. Around him, the archers were silent, waiting for his signal. Henry raised his sword, not to the sky, but forward, toward the storm. "Loose," he said simply. The longbows bent once more, the air filled with the rhythmic snap of strings. Arrows rained down like judgment. The sound was unlike anything else in war. A low hiss, then the dull percussion of impact, hundreds every second. The front lines of the French army disintegrated. Horses reared, screamed, fell. The men behind stumbled over the bodies in front. Still, they came. One French knight, a young baron from Picardy, dragged himself forward, mud sucking at his legs. He could see the enemy through the mist, the thin English line, the ragged men behind wooden stakes. He lifted his sword and shouted, "For France!" An arrow struck his throat before the word left his mouth. He fell without a sound. Behind him, another knight slipped, struck by his comrade's flailing horse. Armor clanged on armor. In the chaos, even the most seasoned nobles became trapped in a tide of panic. The field that should have been their triumph had become a pit. Henry moved among his men, calm and steady. "Hold your ground," he called. "Let them drown in their glory." To his right, Captain York stood bleeding from a wound to the face. "They'll not stop," he said. "They'll die standing before they yield." Henry nodded. "Then let them." The king's voice was low, but every man who heard it drew strength. By midday, the second French charge had collapsed. The mud was now a graveyard, layers of armor glinting beneath shallow water, the dead indistinguishable from the living. The weight of plate and chainmail pulled men down like anchors. Some tried to remove their helmets to breathe, only to expose themselves to arrows. Others clawed at the ground, suffocating under their fallen comrades. A chronicler who witnessed it later wrote, "Never had so many nobles died with so little meaning. And yet, through the horror, the archers kept firing. They had trained for this since boyhood, their arms thickened by years of drawing 100-pound bows, their fingers calloused to leather. To them, the field below was not a tapestry of titles and bloodlines, only targets. Each arrow found its mark. Each pull of the string was survival. Then came the final advance. The French infantry, foot soldiers, mercenaries, and desperate men surged forward, slipping over the bodies of their betters. They reached the English line, crashing into it with the last of their strength. Steel met steel. The sound was deafening, the grind of armor, the screams of men trapped chest to chest, unable to move, killing by inches. The English archers dropped their bows, drew knives, mallets, and short swords, and waded into the melee. They were smaller, faster, freer. Where the knights lumbered like drowning giants, the archers darted between them, stabbing through joints, eyes, throats. One chronicler said the English fought like butchers in a pen. It was not chivalry, it was survival stripped of ceremony. In the center of the chaos, Henry V himself fought. A French knight broke through the line and struck the king's crown from his helmet, denting the metal and cutting his brow. Henry reeled but did not fall. He turned, parried, and drove his sword through the man's chest. Blood mixed with rain on the steel. The king looked down at the body, a nobleman like himself, and whispered, "Forgive me, but this day is not yours." He called to his men, "Forward! For England! For St. George!" The line surged again, driving the French backward. At the rear, French captains tried to rally what remained, but their voices were lost in the noise, the screams of the dying, the crack of broken lances, the dull thud of mud swallowing armor. Even the horses refused. Exhausted, wounded, they balked at the sight of the killing ground. The battlefield that had been meant to showcase the glory of knighthood now exposed its fatal flaw. Wait. For centuries, armor had been protection. At Agincourt, it became a prison. As the afternoon wore on, the rain began again, light, almost gentle. The surviving French tried to flee, but the narrow valley trapped them. Some threw off their armor, crawling through the muck. Others begged for mercy. The English archers, soaked and trembling, lowered their weapons. They had nothing left to shoot. What they saw before them was not an army. It was ruin. Henry rode through the wreckage in silence. Everywhere he saw the same image: men of noble birth, faces hidden behind visors, lying still in the mud beside the common soldiers they had once despised. He dismounted and knelt, touching the waterlogged earth. "May God forgive us," he whispered. For a moment, the field was utterly still. Then in the distance, a single English horn sounded, not in triumph, but as a call to gather. The battle was over. By evening, word began to spread. The English, half starved, half dead, had destroyed an army 4 times their size. Thousands of knights, counts, barons, even princes lay among the fallen. The age of chivalry, which had begun at Hastings and grown through the Crusades, had ended in a French field, drowned beneath its own armor. That night, as torches flickered across the camp, Henry sat alone by a small fire. The rain had stopped. Steam rose from the wet ground. He looked at his hands, still trembling, and said softly, "They called it impossible. Yet here we stand." One of his captains, walking past, heard him add under his breath, "And God help the world now that peasants have learned how to kill kings." Evening of October 25th, 1415, the field of Agincourt. The sun was sinking behind the forests of Tramecourt and Agincourt, staining the clouds crimson. Smoke rose from scattered fires. The battlefield, if it could still be called that, had become a swamp of corpses, armor, and silence. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the damp sweetness of churned earth. Crows circled low, their cries cutting through the heavy quiet. Among the wreckage walked King Henry V, lantern in hand. His boots sank into the mud with each step. Around him, men gathered torches, pulled wounded comrades from piles of armor, and whispered prayers over the dead. It was victory, absolute, unthinkable, and unbearable. He passed rows of bodies half buried in water, knights whose names had once filled songs and chronicles. The Duke of Alençon, the Constable of France, the Marshal of Burgundy, all lay face down in the same mud as the peasants they had led. Henry stopped beside one, brushed the rain from a crest of gold lilies, and said quietly, "So ends the pride of France." A priest beside him murmured, "And the pride of man, my lord." Henry nodded. "Aye, both." In the English camp, exhaustion hung like smoke. Men who had faced death without fear now trembled as the night wind cut through their wet clothes. Arrows had run out, food had run out, even curses had run out. The longbowmen, farmers, butchers, millers, sat by the fires, silent. Some cleaned the mud from their arrows, others simply stared at their hands, swollen and bleeding from the endless pull of bowstrings. One of them, a young man from Wales, whispered to his companion, "I think we broke the world today." His friend nodded slowly. "Aye, and now it will never be the same." In the French camp, what remained of command dissolved into chaos. Survivors stumbled in from the dark, armor dented, faces ghost pale. Some wept openly, others raged at the heavens. Word spread that the constable was dead, that princes had vanished, that whole banners had been wiped from the earth. A captured English messenger, dragged before a furious nobleman, was asked if his king truly believed God favored him. The man replied, "He believes nothing else." Henry gathered his officers beneath a makeshift canopy of torn banners. The rain tapped softly on the fabric above them. "We've held the field," said the Duke of York, voice hollow, "but the French still outnumber us. They're wounded, their reserves," Henry raised a hand, "their courage has drowned. Numbers mean nothing now." He looked out at the field, where the last glimmers of light caught the armor of the fallen. They trusted iron and bloodlines. We trusted wood and will. At midnight, Henry ordered the captured French nobles brought before him. They were bruised, bloodied, their pride more wounded than their flesh. One of them spat at his feet. "You've slain honor itself," the man hissed. "This is no victory. It's butchery." Henry met his gaze. "Honor dies when arrogance blinds it. I gave them a chance to yield." He paused. Tell your king that God is no respecter of rank. He listens to those who stand." The prisoner said nothing more. By dawn, the rain had washed much of the blood away. Mist drifted low over the valley, veiling the dead in white. Henry ordered the heralds to count the fallen. They stopped counting at 10,000. Of those, nearly all were nobles, knights or squires, the very pillars of French chivalry. The English dead numbered less than 400, the arithmetic of the impossible. From the far side of the field, a survivor, the French herald Montjoy, approached the English king. He removed his helmet and bowed deeply. "My lord," he said, "the field is yours." Henry inclined his head. "And yours, to bury your dead." Montjoy's voice trembled. "Never has France seen such ruin." Henry looked toward the grey horizon. "Then may you remember it, so it need not be seen again." That same morning, the English army formed ranks one final time. They stood amid the wreckage, mud, armor, and ash, and sang Non nobis Domine, a psalm of gratitude and humility. The sound rolled across the fields, low and mournful, blending with the sigh of the wind. It was not triumph, it was survival sanctified. When the last verse faded, Henry mounted his horse. His armor was dull now, caked in mud, his crown bent from the blow it had taken. He looked back once at the field. "This day," he said to no one in particular, "we have ended an age." His squire asked, "An age of what, sire?" Henry answered softly, "Of men believing that birth makes them brave." The march north began. The army moved slowly through devastated villages, their feet sinking in mud that seemed endless. They carried with them not trophies but ghosts, the memory of the arrows, the screams, the rain. In every step was the weight of what they had done and what they had undone. When they reached Calais weeks later, the ports erupted in celebration. Bells rang, banners flew, the people cried out Henry's name, but the king said little. To his council he wrote, "We have been the instrument of God's justice, though our hearts are heavy. For I have seen the death of arrogance, and it is no gentle thing." News spread through Europe like wildfire. From Rome to Burgundy, from Flanders to Castile, men spoke of the miracle of Agincourt. But beneath the awe ran unease. If knights could die like common men, if peasants could shape destiny with bows instead of bloodlines, then what was the world becoming? In the monasteries, scholars called it divine judgment. In taverns, soldiers called it progress. In courts, nobles called it an outrage. The age of iron pride was cracking, and through it the light of a new world was beginning to shine, sharp, cold, and unstoppable. Henry returned to England in triumph. Crowds filled the streets of London, chanting his name. Church bells thundered, poets compared him to Alexander, to David, to Caesar, yet when he entered Westminster, he refused a crown of gold. Instead, he carried a wooden cross, the same one that had stood beside his banner at Agincourt. Before the gathered nobles, he said, "This victory was not mine, it was the bowmen's, the ploughman's. The hand that tills the earth now defends it." Some of the lords shifted uneasily. The words tasted like revolution. Years later, chroniclers would write that the Battle of Agincourt ended the reign of the knight and began the rise of the common soldier. But for Henry, the victory was a haunting. He had seen the future, not in glory, but in mud and arrows, and he knew it could never be undone. That night, as torches flickered along the Thames, the king stood alone on the balcony of his chamber. The city below roared with celebration. He looked at the stars, faint through the mist, and whispered to the night, "They called it impossible. But what is impossible once done, but a door that will never close again?" London, 1416, Westminster Palace. The throne room glowed with gold and candlelight. Fresh banners of victory hung from the rafters, embroidered with lions and crosses. Courtiers filled the hall, nobles in velvet and fur, bishops in white and crimson. But at the centre of it all, Henry V sat silent, the weight of Agincourt still heavy upon his shoulders. trumpeters announced foreign envoys, messengers from the Papal States, Burgundy and the Empire, all come to hail the miracle of the English king. They called him Defender of the Faith, Sword of Christendom, the Lion of the North. Henry bowed his head politely to each, though his mind was elsewhere, not on praise, but on the muddy field in France, where thousands of men still lay unburied. When the ceremony ended, he walked alone into the chapel. Rain drummed softly against the stained glass. He removed his crown, setting it on the stone altar. "Lord," he whispered, "grant me not more glory, but more mercy." For all his triumph, he felt the shadow of what had changed. The age of knights had ended, and something new, something colder had begun. The world beyond the throne was shifting. In every corner of Europe, nobles and kings began to fear the longbow, not for its sound, but for its meaning. It was a weapon of the common man, cheap to make, deadly to use, indifferent to status. A peasant could kill a prince from 200 yards away, and no amount of bloodline could stop it. The armorers of France and Burgundy tried to adapt: thicker plates, stronger steel, visors that could deflect the arrowheads of yew and ash. But with every innovation came cost, and with cost came weakness. The battlefield was no longer a stage for aristocracy. It was becoming a machine. In England, the change ran deeper still. Archery became law. Every Sunday after church, every man was required to practice the longbow, from the age of 7 until death. The king's orders were clear: the bow is the spine of England. Across the countryside, the sound of bowstrings became the rhythm of life. Fathers taught sons, villages competed, arrows filled the air like flocks of birds. For the first time in history, a nation armed itself not with nobles, but with farmers. Across the Channel, France reeled. The once proud chivalric order, men whose ancestors had ridden at Crécy and Poitiers, faced ruin. Whole families of nobility had perished in a single day at Agincourt. Their names carved on tombs, their castles inherited by widows and children too young to ride. The poets who once sang of honor and gallantry now wrote laments. One line, copied in countless chronicles, read, "The lilies of France have drowned in their own pride." Yet for all the sorrow, something vital was stirring. The old faith in lineage was giving way to merit. Skill began to matter more than birth, discipline more than inheritance. The seeds of modern warfare, organization, logistics, range, and fire had been planted in the mud of Agincourt. The bow would soon become the gun. The knight would become the officer. The battlefield would never again belong to a single class. But for Henry, victory was not freedom. It was a burden. His success demanded more conquest. Parliament pressed him to return to France, to claim the crown he now believed was his by divine right. In 1417, he gathered his armies once more. This time, the world no longer doubted him. When he landed at Caen, the French resistance collapsed like old timber. Cities surrendered before a single arrow flew. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. Henry recognized as heir to the French throne, his marriage sealed to Catherine of Valois, daughter of the defeated king. The impossible had become inevitable, and yet, in the stillness of his victories, Henry grew uneasy. He had seen how fragile triumph was. Every empire begins with faith and ends with debt. His letters from the French front were filled with weariness rather than pride. "We win not by courage alone, but by the slowness of their despair. I have seen towns open their gates, not for glory, but to stop the hunger." He knew the truth that his courtiers would never speak, that victory, repeated too often, becomes conquest, and conquest, like armor, grows heavier with each use. Meanwhile, the myth of Agincourt began to grow. Minstrels sang of the king who spoke like a soldier and prayed like a monk. Chroniclers wrote of miracles and destiny. In Shakespeare's later pen, Henry's voice would echo through centuries. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." But the real Henry, The man who had walked through mud and blood, who had watched the death of an age, was quieter, grimmer. He once told his chaplain, "We did not win a war, we ended a way of being." The French recovered slowly. New leaders rose from the ashes. Among them a young girl who would one day claim divine voices of her own. But that would come later, long after Henry was gone. For now, the shadow of Agincourt stretched across the century, a reminder that the world had turned, and that even divine right could not protect the proud. In 1422, as disease crept through the king's camp near Meaux, Henry's body began to fail. He was 35. He had conquered France, united two crowns, and destroyed a tradition older than memory. And yet, lying fevered in his tent, he whispered to his priest, "Tell them that courage without wisdom is vanity. Tell them that power is only a test, one that few pass and none survive." He closed his eyes, murmuring a final prayer in Latin. Outside, the rain began to fall once more, the same rain that had soaked the fields of Agincourt. His death marked the end of a brief, blazing era. The kingdoms he united would soon fall apart. The longbow that had changed the world would within a century be replaced by gunpowder, and the knights who died in the mud of France would become legends told by those who no longer needed armor to fight. The age of faith and flesh had become the age of fire and distance. But across time, one truth endured, that on a cold October morning in 1415, when logic said surrender and history said defeat, a handful of men with wooden bows chose to believe otherwise. They changed the geometry of war, they ended the tyranny of lineage, and they reminded the world that sometimes the simplest weapon is the one that changes everything. Agincourt, 6 centuries later. The field is quiet now, the mud long dried, the bones long gone. Wheat grows where armor once sank. The wind moves through the grass with the same whisper it carried that morning in 1415. There is no sound of hooves, no ring of steel, only the slow breath of the land that has outlived all empires. But if you stand there at dawn, when the mist is still thick and pale, you can almost hear it, the faint crack of bowstrings, the echo of a world breaking. Agincourt was not just a battle, it was an ending. For 300 years, knights had ruled war and story alike. Their armor was a creed, their oaths a language of power. The knight was more than a soldier, he was the moral center of his age. But that day, in the rain and the mud, the myth of the invincible man in shining armor drowned. It wasn't crushed by a greater noble or a mightier horse. It was undone by the precision of peasants, by yew wood and goose feathers, by men who had nothing to lose but the right to stand. Agincourt was the sound of the Middle Ages cracking open. Europe would never be the same. From the ashes of chivalry rose a new order, colder, sharper, more disciplined. The weapons of the future would no longer honor bravery, only accuracy. The bow gave birth to the gun, the arrow to the bullet, the battlefield to the nation. The longbowmen of Agincourt had not known it, but they had begun the age of the soldier. An age where courage would be measured not by birth, but by endurance. Where destiny would no longer kneel to bloodlines, but to the geometry of skill. In the centuries that followed, kings learned what Henry had discovered too late, that power rested not in lineage, but in those willing to fight and die for purpose. The longbow's song became the musket's roar, and then the cannon's thunder. The armor that once gleamed under sun and torchlight vanished, replaced by ranks, drills, and smoke. The knight's horse gave way to the engineer's gun carriage, the page's heraldry to the soldier's uniform. The world became faster, louder, more lethal, and less romantic. But Agincourt left something behind, something that survived long after bows and banners. It left the idea that belief itself can be a weapon, that resolve, discipline, and faith in one's craft can overturn the entire structure of the world. It is a lesson older than gunpowder and younger than arrogance. The same lesson that every generation must learn and every empire must forget before it falls. In England, the story became scripture. Chroniclers painted Henry as chosen by God, his army as saints of endurance. The band of brothers, the phrase he never actually spoke, became a myth greater than truth. Shakespeare would breathe immortality into it 2 centuries later, giving Henry's voice to the ages. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Words that would echo not just in theatres, but in trenches, in speeches, in the hearts of those who fought when all odds were against them. That was Agincourt's true legacy, not conquest, not crowns, but courage turned into memory. Meanwhile, in France, the defeat became a scar, one that would later give birth to redemption. A generation after Henry's death, a young girl named Jeanne d'Arc would rise, claiming voices from heaven and leading her people to fight again. The spirit that had drowned in the mud of Agincourt found new breath in her fire. In that strange symmetry of history, the end of one age became the seed of another. Agincourt killed the knight, but it awakened the martyr. Across Europe, the social order trembled. As armor rusted and the bow gave way to powder, the distinction between noble and commoner thinned. The wars that followed would be fought not by chosen men, but by nations. The battlefield had been democratized, and with it, death itself. What was lost in chivalry was not only romance, but restraint. The wars of the future would have no rules, no codes, no duels of honor. They would be fought in shadows, in cities, with fire and iron. Agincourt opened the door, and once opened, it would never close. Yet for all its violence, the memory of that day still inspires something rare. Not cruelty, not conquest, but endurance. When the weak stand against the impossible, when skill and discipline outweigh power and pride, the spirit of Agincourt returns, not in armor or arrow, but in defiance. Because the story of that field is not the death of the knight. It is the victory of humanity and flawed, fragile, unarmored over the illusions of destiny. Today, the name Agincourt is whispered in history books, engraved on memorials, recited in plays. But its heartbeat lives wherever the few face the many, wherever courage stands barefoot in the mud and says, "No further." That is the quiet truth Henry understood as the rain washed the blood from his hands. Victory is never the crown. It is the choice to rise when reason says fall. If you visit the field now, it is peaceful, green and gold beneath a wide French sky. A single cross marks the spot where the English line once stood. The wind hums through the grass, and for a moment the centuries blur. You can almost see them. The arches, the mud, the grey sky, the king's face, streaked with rain and sweat. And in that silence, one lesson remains. Even the mightiest armor cannot outlast a steady hand, and even the proudest age must bow before the impossible.